home and homicide.
Who knows, Mr. Gibson, what is and what is not relevant?
What is it you want?
The truth.
The problem of Thor Bridge on Newshour.
With the help of the God of Justice and my colleague Dr. Watson, I will give you a case that will make England ring.
Tonight at 9:30, following Wonderworks.
Is living in Iowa the same as living in the Horn of Plenty? I'm Morgan Halgren, and on this week's show, we'll see how one man serves 1,500 at his annual pre-Thanksgiving gathering in Corning, and we'll share the motion and emotion of the National Cornhusking Championship in Kimballton. Plus, take a Living in Iowa enraptured look at Iowa's beautiful raptors. Watch Living in Iowa, always something a little different, Friday night at 8:30.
Iowa Public Television.
TV worth watching. IPTV.
Where available, MacNeil News Hour can be heard with Spanish translation by using the second audio program channel on your stereo TV or stereo VCR. Acquisition of this program was made possible by Friends of Iowa Public Television. And the Iowa broadcast is made possible by CRST, a family-owned company based in Iowa and a major truck carrier in the United States, which is proud to support the MacNeil News Hour.
Good evening. Leading the news this Thanksgiving, President Bush called for a political truce with Democrats to forge an economic recovery plan. Muammar Gaddafi refused to turn over 2 Libyans charged in the bombing of Pan Am 103. And the U.S. agreed to pay Iran $278 million for weapons seized after the 1979 hostage crisis. We'll have details in our news summary in a moment. After the news summary, we look at multicultural education and its impact on American schools. Then a report on some Canadian bargain hunters who are making American retailers very happy. And an essay about downsizing.
Funding for the News Hour has been provided by AT&T. AT&T has supported the MacNeil News Hour since 1983 because quality information and quality communication is our idea of a good connection. AT&T, the right choice. And by PepsiCo. And by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, and by the financial support of viewers like you.
President Bush used his annual Thanksgiving Day message to call for a temporary truce with congressional Democrats. He said he knew that hard times were hurting Americans and accused Congress of failing to pass a comprehensive package of economic growth measures. Mr. Bush called for a hold on partisan bickering despite the approach of an election year. He spoke from the presidential retreat at Camp David.
Congress left town after a particularly bitter session. We now have a few weeks in which elected officials can cool off and hear from the people they serve. When I give the State of the Union speech in January, I will ask Congress to lay aside election year politics at least long enough to enact a common sense series of economic growth measures. I will ask politicians to restrain their personal ambitions at least long enough to get the job done. Afterward, the normal election year battling can resume.
President Bush has reportedly authorized a major shift in U.S.-Soviet policy. The shift is away from the Soviet central government and toward the republics. According to a New York Times report, the U.S. is planning to recognize the Ukraine if its citizens vote for independence in a Sunday referendum. Soviet President Gorbachev today expressed concern about that report. He issued a statement saying such a move would violate the recent spirit of U.S.-Soviet relations. The Ukraine is the second largest of the Soviet republics. Administration officials told the Times the U.S. will grant formal recognition to the republic within weeks of a pro-independence vote, but they said the Ukraine would first have to ease U.S. concerns about disarmament and control over nuclear weapons, among other things. There was sporadic shelling in Yugoslavia's Croatian Republic today, but little fighting. For some, the lull in hostilities was an opportunity to free the republic into Hungary, as Peter Sharp of Independent Television News reports.
They straggle in every day. Survivors of places like Vukovar and Osijek,
and dozens of other battered towns and villages whose names are as yet unknown outside Croatia. The Hungarian army barracks at Neuhausen is home for some 2,000 refugees. Hundreds more arrive each day. They are among some 40,000 refugees that have poured across the border from Croatia since the fighting began in June. Throughout the day, they gather at the single phone box that serves the camp, their only link back to Yugoslavia, their only opportunity to trace missing friends and family. It's the small children who are coping best. Christmas in Croatia comes next week. For all of them, it'll be their first away from their homes. There are over 1,000 children in this camp alone, and the local Red Cross is fast running out of funds. The Director General of the British Red Cross, who visited the camp today, was told there was only one ambulance for more than 2,000 people.
Well, it's obvious that the first and the greatest need is cash. The Hungarian people themselves and the government have clearly are trying to do their best, but the annual budget for the whole of the refugee population here in Hungary was spent up 2 weeks ago, and they're into next year's budget. There are 2,500 people here who've got to be fed, and they're being fed 3 times a day. That costs an awful lot of money. It's all being brought in from outside, so that the costs are even higher than they need be. So one of the things we may be able to help with is re-equipping the kitchen so the refugees can actually cook for themselves.
Over the next week, they'll be following the progress of the peace talks, asking for nothing more than a chance to return to their homes.
Syria has accused Israel of trying to derail the Middle East peace process. A foreign ministry spokesman said Syria will be in Washington for talks next Wednesday, despite Israel's request for a 5-day delay. It said Israel's failure to appear would be proof once again that Israel does not want peace. Israel, meanwhile, sent mixed signals today. A government spokesman said Israel would stick to its demand for a delay, but he also said he hoped some sort of compromise was possible. Libyan leader Muammar Gaddafi has said he will not turn over 2 Libyan intelligence agents indicted in the bombing of Pan Am Flight 103. 270 people were killed when the plane exploded over Lockerbie, Scotland in December 1988. We have a report narrated by Richard Vaughan of Worldwide Television News.
In Tripoli, photographs of the accused agents were examined by Colonel Gaddafi. The Libyan leader maintained that one of the men charged was a case of mistaken identity, and the other had no involvement in the Secret Service. He was adamant that Libya had no connection with the Lockerbie bombing, saying that, as he put it, less than a shred of a fingernail of evidence had been produced against it. Gaddafi challenged the US and Britain to bring their evidence before a neutral party, claiming that a smear campaign was being mounted against Libya. Asked about paying compensation to the victims' families, Gaddafi said he saw no obstacle to a humanitarian contribution, but anything more would be an admission of guilt. The Libyan leader was emphatic that the accused would not face trial. Libya has no extradition treaties with the US or Britain, and Gaddafi said the wanted men will be staying home.
The United States and Britain yesterday demanded that Libya turn over the 2 agents. Neither country said what it would do if Libya failed to comply. The U.S. has signed an agreement to pay Iran $278 million for weapons impounded after the 1979 Iranian hostage crisis. An official of the Claims Tribunal in The Hague said the money will be paid when the agreement is officially filed on Friday. The settlement is an important step in resolving several $billion in Iranian claims against the United States. They involve military equipment ordered by Iran, but impounded after the 1979 hostage crisis at the U.S. Embassy in Tehran. The U.S. military continued construction of its Haitian refugee camp at Guantanamo Bay, Cuba today. The tent city will house at least 2,500 refugees when it's completed this weekend. Thousands of refugees have fled Haiti in boats since the September military coup. Those intercepted by the Coast Guard are being taken to Guantanamo until a federal court decides their legal status. Back in this country, tens of thousands of Thanksgiving dinners were prepared today to feed the nation's poor and homeless. In Washington, D.C., an annual holiday tradition was repeated near the Capitol building. An organization called the Community for Creative Nonviolence presented dinner with all the fixings. Dozens of volunteers served turkey, vegetables, cranberries, sweet potatoes, and a variety of pies. In Indianapolis, some 500 volunteers cooked a similar feast for an estimated 25,000 needy people, while 17,000 turkey dinners were prepared in Baltimore. That's it for the news summary. Just ahead on the News Hour, making education multicultural, Canadians buying American, and an essay about little things. On this Thanksgiving Day, our lead focus is on teaching American history. At a time when Americans traditionally gather and think about the past, many historians are wrestling with whose version of history to teach. The move towards multicultural education has turned once simple stories about pilgrims and Indians into debates about whose perspective to reflect, that of white settlers or Native Americans. Earlier this week, I spoke to 4 educators about the multicultural debate, and we'll hear that discussion after a backgrounder about one school district caught in the middle. Spencer Michaels of public station KQED San Francisco has our report.
Let's move it. In the Oakland Public School District this semester, children in the 4th, 5th, and 7th grades aren't getting the new history textbooks they were promised. And many of these youngsters aren't getting any history books at all.
Just do it like you were doing it when you were working together in the library.
Teachers are scrambling to fill the void created when the school board voted not to accept a new series of textbooks developed by Houghton Mifflin Publishers and adopted by the state. In a published curriculum guide called a framework, the state education department had called for an innovative approach to history and social studies. It mandated multicultural perspectives in teaching history. It also called for a minimum of 3 years of world history and the study of the role of religion.
Do we have that book?
Only one publisher came up with a textbook series acceptable to the state. Books designed to teach children about Asian, African, Hispanic, and Native American cultures and histories, as well as the more traditional European material. State School Superintendent Bill Honig thinks the new books are the best he has seen.
The books met the framework. The framework wanted to tell the story of history, wanted to use original documents, wanted to get the kids to think, wanted to present alternative viewpoints, wanted to be multicultural, wanted to talk about common values that hold us together and give a sense of how democracy emerged and give kids a sense of how the world came to be. It does it.
Teachers overwhelmingly, and I mean teachers of color as well as white teachers, overwhelmingly have endorsed these books.
UCLA professor Gary Nash is one of the book's authors. He talked with reporter Achille Buchanan.
Take these books into a classroom where they've been piloted. All right, pick your school. I'll take any one you want. And I'll bet you that you're going to find teachers saying, these are exciting, rich materials. We've never had anything nearly this good.
The textbooks are racist. Period. They're racist.
In Oakland, 91% of the students in the district are non-white. A recent school board meeting erupted with strenuous objections to the very same books praised by Superintendent Honig. Parents and activists, some from other cities, challenged the notion that publishers and scholars are the sole arbiters of historical truth. Black Studies professor Mary Hoover of San Francisco State University was among those urging non-acceptance.
The books are outrageous. They are outrageous. They constitute what we consider educational apartheid because they take some groups of us, African Americans and Africans, Mexican Americans and Mexicans, Asians, Native people, women, working class people, and denigrate us while eulogizing Europeans.
Critics at this meeting and at several others in the Bay Area came from almost every ethnic group. Some Native Americans say their persecution in America is sanitized. Some African Americans charge the books justify slavery. Some Chinese Americans say the Exclusion Act that barred them from this country is ignored. Some Japanese Americans say their World War II internment is trivialized. Some Jews claim the books favor Christianity. And some Arabs point out that while other cultures are depicted by persons in traditional garb, their culture is represented by a camel. Board members heard from a resident who summed up many of the complaints about how the schools treat black children.
They stay all day in school being taught that black Americans were slaves, and that's it. They're not told that the first self-made woman millionaire in America was a black woman named Madam C.J. Walker. And the list just goes on and on. You grow up believing that you are what you told your ancestors were. You grow up believing that you are something wild from Africa.
A chapter in the 4th grade book on California missions sparked a major debate over how the treatment of Native Americans was depicted. The book described how Spanish settlers came to California to convert the indigenous population to Catholicism. Beverly Slapin of Communities United Against Racism objects to that text.
Starting a mission was a way for Father Serra to bring the Indians into the Catholic Church. He believed that he was offering them something wonderful, religious faith. In return, they would leave their Indian way of life to live at the mission. Father Serra would also teach the Indians farming skills and trade crafts so that they would be able to support themselves. Well, excuse me, but indigenous peoples have been supporting themselves for thousands and thousands of years. Now, they will say, Houghton Mifflin will say, well, we talk about problems at the missions. Well, the missions were death camps, pure and simple. Indian people were killed, and they died like flies from torture, starvation, overwork, and European diseases. Saying problems at the missions and talking about a few problems that happened is like saying there were some problems at Auschwitz.
We talk about how difficult it was for Indian people. Some ran away, but soldiers usually brought them back and sometimes whipped them. Others wanted to revolt. And we quote a 24-year-old Gabrielina woman. When she was arrested and questioned by the governor, she answered, "I hate the Padres and all of you for living here on my native soil, for trespassing upon the land of my forefathers." Well, you see, we're trying to give kids the mission system from the Spanish point of view and the Indian point of view. The critics don't want Father Serra's point of view or the Spanish point of view represented in these books.
Most teachers in Oakland who examined the books thought they dealt fairly with the races. Jack Sheehan teaches junior high school history.
The 7th grade teachers have overwhelmingly recommended that across the centuries be adopted. Please support that recommendation. Thank you.
When other supporters of the books tried to speak, there was disruption.
So we would appreciate it now if you would show some respect and tolerance. So thank you.
If you cannot go by the rules of the chair, we're not going to arrest you. We'll just have you removed.
Remove me. Arrest me.
State Schools Chief Bill Honig was appalled at the process in Oakland.
You listen to the people that objected, and you'd show them examples. Here's one point of view, here's the opposite point of view, right in the book. That wasn't good enough for them. They only wanted the negative point of view. There's a radical political agenda. We want to talk about how sexist the country is, how racist the country is, how rotten the country is, and if you show anything positive, it violates that agenda. You have to appeal to resentment, appeal to anger, and you're trying to build group solidarity. That's the way you make your political points. And if that's your attitude, then you don't want an educational book, you want a political document.
Local school board members denied bowing to such political pressure. Tony Cook objected to the tone of the series.
It does not talk about us as people of color as having an impact on global affairs and world affairs. To put me in a book 100 more times than you put me in the last book is like saying I hired 10 more Negroes. 9 of them are janitors and 1 of them is a maid. But none of them write a check and none of them make decisions.
Hodges?
No.
Jordan?
Yes.
Lawson?
No.
President Anderson?
No.
By a 4-3 majority, Oakland became one of only 2 districts, and by far the largest in California, to reject all the textbooks. As a result of the board vote, many classrooms throughout Oakland began the school year with no history texts. In this 4th grade, the only text is a supplemental volume on American Indians.
If you were sewing a garment and you wanted to put some sinew to the leather, would you use that to make a hole? 5 will get you 10, it's an all.
In this 6th grade classroom, the teacher has begun a unit on early man by Xeroxing a couple of pages from the historical novel Clan of the Cave Bear, and has distributed copies of National Geographic from his own collection.
They had furniture made of wood. Remember, wood was precious. It was expensive.
At Bret Harte Junior High, Jack Sheehan's 7th grade history class depends upon Jack Sheehan.
Last year I spent over $3,000.
Out of your own pocket?
Out of my own pocket.
He has bought art and history books which he lends to his pupils in the classroom and to take home. Sheehan is disheartened by the rejection of the Houghton Mifflin series.
I think to make a blanket rejection of Houghton Mifflin textbooks was an overreaction. It is much, much better than the dinosaur that we were using. I mean, the book that we'd been using for the past 8 years was terrible.
The entire history curriculum changed this year to include new material on Africa, Asia, and other areas previously neglected. Sheehan says many teachers are not yet familiar with those areas, and so the lack of a textbook will hurt the kids even more.
Everyone else in California gets a new book, and we don't. And so therefore, we're at a disadvantage because we don't get to learn stuff that we need to know for 7th grade, but all the other students in California do.
Well, if this year, if they make a test on that certain book, we're not going to know most of the stuff that's going to be on the test, and the other cities around us that have the new book will get better scores than we will.
Unless the school board changes its mind, and there's been no hint that it will, Oakland classrooms won't get new history texts for years. Instead, this financially strapped district will attempt with some haste to develop acceptable teaching materials on its own, and that could start the whole debate anew.
And that debate is not unique to Oakland. The question of how history should be taught is being raised in school districts all across the country. We take it up now with 4 educators. Sylvia Winter is a professor of Afro-American history at Stanford University. Nathan Glazer is a professor of education and sociology at Harvard. He joins us from Boston. Patricia Limerick is a professor of Western history at the University of Colorado. She's in Denver tonight. Carl Degler is a retired professor of history at Stanford University. He joins us from San Francisco. Carl Degler, what do you make of the Oakland situation, what it says about the efforts to introduce multiculturalism into the textbooks?
Well, I think the Oakland situation has pushed the whole question of multiculturalism into an abyss, if you will. I think the whole question of multiculturalism is how can we bring into the history of the United States the diversity of people that have been a part of it almost from the beginning. And as far as I can tell, this new textbook has certainly worked in that direction, and apparently very successfully from the standpoint of many teachers. What Oakland seems to be saying is that you've done this, but you haven't done it enough. And there's always going to be a conflict among various groups as to which one gets as much prominence as it would like, or the kind of presentation that it would like. In fact, it's an old story in immigration history, if you will. There's always compensatory history. Tell us about the best Italians. Tell us about the great Germans. Tell us about the great Scots people, and so on. So that the story here is, in one way, a repetition, but on the other hand, it seems to be making multiculturalism not a real way of looking at the history of the United States as a whole. And that, to me, is what we really ought to be looking at. That is, who are Americans, not just a large group of people or 2 genders, but rather what makes them American, even though they are diverse.
Sylvia Winter, what do you think about the Oakland situation?
Well, first of all, I think I'd like to just clarify that I am in Afro-American studies and not history.
I beg your pardon.
I think this is very important because I thought the books had been written with rigor and care, but as I wrote to the state education, because I intervened in it, asked to do so by Professor Joyce King. Now, Professor Joyce King is an educator, and this is very important, not a historian. I am from Black Studies, not a historian. And she was part of the big surge in which we fought, Black Studies fought its way into academia. Now, as I explained to them, once Black Studies, feminist studies, and so on, had fought their way into academia, something fundamental had happened. A challenge was being made to mainstream body of knowledge that was as profound as the challenge made by the lay humanists to the scholastics between the 13th and the 15th century, in which the West would revolutionize itself and then spread out and literally take over the entire world.
The beginning of the Reformation, the challenging of the religious domination.
And we are, as humans, as all humans, I think, faced with such a parallel transformation. And so I think what is very interesting about the Oakland School Board is that at that time too, at that first revolution, theology, which had been the protected discourse of theologians, became the province of laymen and women, Galileo, Newton, etc. That's what made the natural sciences possible. And you see, I am arguing that although we have scientific knowledge of the physical world and of biological life after Darwin, we have no scientific knowledge of our social reality. We have objective knowledge. The objective knowledge is not scientific knowledge. And when these people fought their way, when we fought our way into the university, we were saying we are moving towards, can we have scientific knowledge of the social reality of which we're a part?
But as I understand it, it isn't the threatened orthodoxy, which in this case would be white Eurocentric domination of textbooks, that is objecting. It is those groups which the white group might think would benefit from the multiculturalism of people of color, Native Americans, and so on.
Well, I'm also...
And particularly black Americans or African Americans.
Well, I want to show why we cannot benefit from the book, because the perspective is written from that of immigrant America. Most Americans, if you say, oh, America is a land of immigrants, we accept it. But that is not so. The indigenous peoples of this continent are not immigrants. They domesticated this continent. Black Americans came in the slave ships. They did not come to the dream of freedom that all the textbooks sing about. Chicanos are not immigrants. They were conquered. So try and understand, there is a fundamental conceptual distortion in the conceptualization. And with all, how much you try, you have marginalized the non-immigrant groups, and you have made immigrant Americans into the generic Americans. And that is really the fundamental error of the book. It's not racist, it's not white, it's not Eurocentric. It has to do, Robin, with the centricity of all human cultures, including the one in which we now are in.
Patricia Limerick, how do you see this, this controversy over the effort in California to get more multicultural content into the books?
Well, I have to say it personally pains me, and I'm going to, in the next few minutes, hold on to the shreds of optimism that I have here, because even though you say at this stage it is not the whites objecting, God knows in the rest of this country and the other controversies the whites are objecting. The whole to-do about political correctness shows indeed a lot of white resistance to this kind of change, so even if they were not present at the meeting in Oakland, they're there. Now what pains me so is that I was under the impression, I think no more than 2 or 3 years ago, that this was the greatest possible moment to be an American historian, because we were indeed including these people who were so crucial to our history, Indian people, our history, to the history of this planet. We had Indian people, we had Chicano people who are more interesting than any in some ways, because they are both conquerors and conquered. They're originally part of a Spanish colonization that preceded English colonization. We had Asian American eastward movement and migration to enrich the story of westward migration. It seemed to me 3 or 4 years ago that the time to be a Western American historian, to be an American historian, was now, because it was so exciting, and stories that had been rendered so dull were coming to life, and even those poor fellows, those dead white men, were getting more interesting than they had ever been before. So, now, having said all that, it does pain me to see that we are not quite in the celebratory mood of exciting intellectual challenges that I thought that I'm still trying to be in, and that I think we could be in. But then again, I have to say to myself and to everybody else, this is a much overdue transition. For 150 years or more, we had in this country a kind of history which was faith-affirming history for white Americans, and we are now going through a transition away from that faith-affirming history, and no wonder it's graceless. No wonder it's awkward and painful, because you cannot have a century and a half of doing it another way and then make an easy, comfortable change to a more accurate kind of history. So, personal pain, but I'm holding on to optimism.
Are you optimistic about this movement, Nathan Glazer?
Well, no, not very. I must say I was taken aback by Professor Winters's comments and by some of the comments in the Oakland hearings. As Professor Limerick pointed out, these texts come out of a process which has gone as far as anyone has gone to acknowledge people of color, minority groups, subcultural elements in American society. And and I think it did it very well from what I know about it, to have heard this attacked in this, from the point of view that so much more is necessary. I wonder what more is necessary, what more can be done, and I'm afraid what is going to be more is a kind of serious distortion of truth and reality. It is not the case that the Chicanos were conquered. There are certainly Mexican Americans who were here when at the time of the Mexican-American War, but the overwhelming number of Mexican Americans are immigrants. It is not the case, as far as I can see, that this is a history given from an immigrant perspective. We call immigrants post-colonial settlers from the Irish and the Germans on, and on the whole, the textbooks, and I'm sure the California textbooks I haven't seen, have very little to say about them. From my examination of textbooks, even before the multicultural revolution, I see a great deal of attention to Native Americans, a great deal of attention, as one must give, to the racial issue in American society. It's true very little to the Mexican-American element, but I think that is increasing. I think the problem that struck me most forcefully is that we have agreed in this country that our local school systems are at the top politically run. But how do we manage a political system in which error, distortion, and falsehood is insisted upon, and where there is a right to impose it? In such things as something called the Portland baseline essays and so on. And that's a terrible problem. I think that there is a tremendous amount of goodwill on all sides for a multicultural orientation in social studies. That was an orientation of the California books. It was argued for in a recent report in New York State. It's much approved of by teachers, as we saw from Oakland. But we then have these political resistance groups who are arguing for rather extreme versions of history told from a very distinct perspective. And I don't know how we're going to deal with that problem. We're not France, we're not Japan, where we have a Ministry of Education that can impose some central truth. We do have the contradictions. One of the students pointed out in Oakland that while the local districts may insist on their own special versions of history, there are such things as statewide and national tests.
How you make the curriculum multicultural, adequately reflect the diversity of this country and how different groups contributed to what the country is today, without exaggerating or distorting history.
May I explain that I myself am not at all a multiculturalist. There are two forms of multiculturalism. There's ethnic multiculturalism of Diane Ravitch, for example. From an ethnic perspective, she sees it as a question of ethnic revival. But there's racial multiculturalism coming from Professor Joyce King, and so we could work on that. I am a transculturalist. I believe that we, at the moment in the United States, live within a single cultural model. This cultural model was generated from Western Europe. It's a cultura franca. I believe it is globally hegemonic. I believe the destruction of the planetary environment actually comes from the cultural homogenizing that is going on. Even the demand for multiculturalism is a Western European idea. So I believe that what we are really confronted with, and as I told them, I said, had you asked women, black studies, and all of these, we can no longer approach the past except from multiple perspectives in which we can then cancel out each other's exaggerations or biases. I believe that we must have a scientific view of the past. I believe we can only live and reconcile ourselves by a scientific ethic by saying, how can we know what really happened? But to do that, I think we have to, I think as she said, that much of the history was written to bring together Euro-Americans. That is to say, to integrate all the immigrants of Europe. And it did this superbly well. We should go now. So when you had American fiction, Ellison's book could not be an American fiction. And therefore, you actually have a racial curriculum because it was the racial factor, this recognition signal of whiteness that was used to integrate
Nathan Glaser?
Every curriculum dealing with fiction in this country at every level includes books by blacks now. It's Ellison, it's Baldwin, it's I mean, I don't know what she is talking about.
I know, but I'm saying we must ask the question, why did they exclude it? What were the rules governing the scholars' exclusion that functioned beyond their conscious awareness?
Is that the most important issue now discussed, why Ellison wasn't there?
That is the most important issue, because how do we know our social reality? How are we going to, for example, stop the behaviors that are destroying the planet, except we understand that it is related to the body of knowledge in the university?
Let me go back to Carl Degler in San Francisco. You know, how do we do this without totally distorting history? How do you compensate for what may have been past error without an exercise that just makes some previously neglected racial groups or ethnic groups feel better without totally distorting history?
Well, let me say, first of all, history is not a science. History changes. What we see as the past changes depending on how we look upon certain people and certain individuals in the past. We all know that. And what I think a multicultural approach has to do is to say, look, there are these great varieties of people that have lived in the past, that are living here now, and what we're trying to do is to say, how did they contribute, what did they add to, how did they help to shape the history of the United States? There are going to be some very bad things that are going to come out of that. It's not going to be all compensatory or supportive of groups. It has to be at least a certain balance. It has to be, you have to recognize that if on the one hand the Europeans were conquering the Amerindians in the New World, at the same time there was a counter interest on the part of the Amerindians toward the Europeans. This was a clash of cultures, and you can't look at it from a moral point of view and say who was right and who was wrong, because and then you have Indian spokespeople saying, we were here first, you should never have come in the first place. But we did come, and that's what history is about, and that is that something happened, and what we're trying to do is understand it, not to make moral judgments, not to condemn, and not necessarily to give anyone a sense of self-confidence in the process. If you talk about the slave trade, for example, you have to point out that the slaves came over to the New World primarily because Africans enslaved them first, or captured them in war and sold them to the Europeans. They weren't picked up by the Europeans in the depths of Africa. They were brought by Africans, and you have to say that, along with the fact that the whites were the ones, of course, that traded for them and brought them here and found them extremely useful. And in fact, I would say, was a large basis for the economic success of the United States as an economic power in the middle years of the 19th century.
Patricia Limerick, what's your answer to the question of how you do this without exaggerating the importance of some peoples or distorting history?
Well, I have to say, in this whole giant national debate, I sometimes feel that I carry unique authority because I teach the American History Survey class. I actually go in 2 or 3 times a week and teach freshman the American History Survey. It is not a crisis. Everybody gets so heated in public. In fact, you can do presidents and you can do, oops, I just lost my contacts with them. So anyway, I'll just keep talking. You can do the whole package. You can do the picture in complexity, and you don't have to give up the presidents because you were putting in the role of slaves or anything like that. Anybody who actually teaches these courses knows that it's practical. Historians cannot offer anybody faith-affirming history anymore. We cannot give any group that, but what we can serve is a much more important and much more valuable function, and I truly do believe this, that history can be a therapeutic business. That is, we can offer the American nation the same kind of service that a therapist could offer a troubled family. You can help that nation understand where it came from, where the individuals came from, where all our present dilemmas came from. We can indeed serve a therapeutic function, but for instance, when I know, Professor Glaser, I know that your heart is on the right place on this one, but when you say now black writers are in the curriculum, think for a moment about how recent the onset of that is, and how distrustful minority people might well still be about how deep the change is, including a token black writer. How far does that go? So yes, I think we do have a difficult transition, but those of us who teach the survey course, I think, can tell you what you can't tell from these public debates, we're fine. We're doing fine. American history is richer and more interesting and more instructive and more valuable than it's ever been.
I agree with you, Patricia, that I'm sure you teach the survey course wonderfully. Do you think you could manage it in Oakland after hearing those comments?
I'd like to hear her answer to that question.
Well, you know, the curious thing was that I was disconnected and need to hear the question.
Well, he just asked you, he thinks you probably teach the survey course wonderfully. Do you think you could teach it in Oakland, having heard that?
You know, this may prove me to be the fool of the whole controversy. I would like to give it a try. Because the one thing that is a terrible thing about being an historian is if no one cares about your subject. If you're teaching what people have, if you have students, they think it's a requirement, they're there because they're going to have to memorize some facts and dates, that is killing. That is the thing that I would never do. If you asked me to teach a course to people who were simply taking it as a requirement, who had no idea that it might matter, well, this, God knows, this is the direct opposite of that. This is the deepest passions and concerns, and I believe so deeply in the value of history that I'd give it a try. You bet. Yeah. Speaking invitations from Oakland, I'll take them too.
Carl Degler, are we, with the obvious good intentions behind multiculturalism, are we in danger of dividing the country up, as Arthur Schlesinger suggests in his book, The Disuniting of America?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think I wouldn't put it quite in the sense of in danger of dividing up the country. What I find is lacking in the whole emphasis of multiculturalism in school curricula at this point is that we're not talking about what are Americans? Who are Americans? What do they stand for? How do we define an American? And to talk about these individual groups as if they are entities in their own right, without having been shaped or reshaped by the environment in which they have been brought up, but that they have been in American society. All one knows from even the immigrant experience in the early 20th century, when these Europeans went back to Europe. They were immigrants, but they'd been in America. They saw themselves as quite different from the place they had to which they returned, and the people who received them found them to have been changed by their American experience. What we need to do, it seems to me, is to say, what do we mean when we talk about an American society which is multicultural, which has great variety of groups within it? What is American? And I think one way of doing this, it's sort of my favorite device, is to say we ought to look at other countries that have gone through similar experiences, that have had movement into new lands, that have encountered native peoples. The frontier in Australia is quite different from what we call the frontier in the United States. The relations between whites and Indians on the American Western movement, quite different from the Canadian when the English moved into the West. And those differences, those contrasts, it seems to me, would give us a good bit of insight as to what it means to be an American, and it would be shaping all of the groups, as well as the groups having their own individual contribution to make to the overall picture.
Well, I hate to interrupt you, yes, but we've come to the end of our time, so I have to leave it there, and thank you all. Carl Degler, Patricia Limerick, Nathan Glazer, and Cynthia Winter. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanksgiving Day always means sales, but this year, with consumer confidence sagging, retailers are more anxious than usual to jumpstart the Christmas buying season. But there is one group of shoppers who need no urging: Canadians coming across the U.S. border. Higher Canadian taxes and lower U.S. prices have created a windfall for American retailers. Earlier this fall, correspondent Fred de Sam Lazaro of public station KTCA Minneapolis-St. Paul visited the bustling Minnesota-Ontario border and filed this report.
In International Falls, Minnesota, the merchants of Main Street leave no doubt about which side of the border they are on. Across the Rainy River in Fort Frances, Ontario, there is similar patriotic fervor. Here, however, showing the flag isn't doing enough to help the fortunes of shopkeepers. The people seeing the most business in Fort Frances are the gatekeepers to this border town, like Customs Inspector Ray Martinson.
We've seen quite a large increase in traffic over the last couple of years.
Most of the traffic Martinson sees consists of Canadians returning from short excursions to the U.S., lured there by low prices.
I just bought bread and milk and pop, and I probably saved $5 on it.
It's worth your while coming down for even such a small purchase.
Well, I'm not done yet.
Where are you going next to, like?
Kmart.
Could be 35%.
What kinds of things did you purchase today?
Oh, eggs and some chicken and bread and milk.
I must have saved about, I don't know, a good 20 bucks anyways.
What was your total?
It was 47.
Grocer Phil Paulbeck doesn't need much advertising or hype to fuel the windfall. His normal prices on most items offer huge savings to Canadians. Paulbeck has made an effort to stock merchandise of special interest and at better prices to Canadians. Cigarettes in particular are a big hit.
A carton of cigarettes in Canada, essentially the same product, is approximately $45 a carton. Here the price is about $16 or $17 a carton.
Paying only a third here for cigarettes made back in their own country angers many Canadians. Although Canada's retail industry typically has higher labor costs and profit margins, higher taxes account for much of the price difference. Earlier this year, a new goods and services tax added 7% to that burden. Fort Francis Mayor Dick Lyon says it turned a steady flow of so-called out-shoppers into an exodus.
It's almost like a tax revolt. People are saying, I've had enough. I'm going to go and get some bargain someplace. There again, how can you blame people for doing that kind of thing?
In a small town, few people blame their neighbors very loudly. But in a big city like Calgary, newspaper editor Catherine Ford isn't ticklish about lecturing out-shoppers.
Yeah, things are more expensive here. Tough bananas. You're a Canadian, you live in this country, you pay our taxes. If we have a problem with the taxes that are imposed on our consumer goods, I think it behooves us to deal with it inside our own country. You don't take your money to a foreign country and make them rich and say, well, this is my individual argument.
Ford says Canadian shoppers will drop $2.3 billion in U.S. retail stores this year alone. The lost tax revenues are sorely needed for a wide array of social services Canadians enjoy, notably free health care. Out-shoppers rarely pay provincial sales tax. Ford also suspects many evade federal excise duties by wearing new clothing or jewelry purchases and concealing other items.
I don't think you'll ever put a stop to it, but I certainly think that we can treat it with a scorn that it deserves. You're a thief. You're a thief and you're a smuggler.
Our detections have increased, so therefore we presume that the trend to smuggle has increased, but again, that's really very difficult to put a hard and fast number on.
At the same time, Customs Officer Martinson adds there's been a 70% increase in the past year in the number of people paying duty on their purchases. In other words, many Canadians are honest and still save substantially by shopping the U.S. This is especially true of big-ticket items, for which they seem willing to travel even farther. Duluth, Minnesota is about 200 miles from the nearest major Canadian city, Thunder Bay, Ontario. That distance hasn't stopped Canadian shoppers, it's just spawned more hotel business. At Duluth's Best Buy electronics store, business is so good, manager Scott Borland fills a semi-truck for Canadian deliveries as often as once a week.
Music, software, computers, camcorders are big, big screens, television, everything we carry seems to be what they're looking for.
I bought a CD player up here for $139, and the same exact model back home was roughly $350, $369. Figuring with the exchange on that, it came to $200, saving $169.
Are you catching any flack at home for doing this kind of thing?
Oh, yeah. But it's basically on the recession, and everybody's looking for a good deal and save some money.
Do you get any pangs of guilt for having done this?
No, not a bit. A dollar's a dollar.
You know, we're a one-income family, and we have, 4 kids. 2 of them you know, we're virtually away from home now, but they still come home to eat.
It's tough to look at someone who's just trying to keep body and soul together and explain that by trying to get a bargain, that you're only making it worse for the rest of us, that you're making it worse for people who are trying to hang on to their Canadian jobs and to the Canadian companies that are trying to do business in this country.
How you doing, Jer?
Oh, fine, Glenn.
Both of them?
Yes, please.
The economic ripple effect is already being felt in smaller, frontline border communities like Fort Frances. The Witherspoon family has owned this gas station for 4 decades. When Canada raised energy prices to encourage conservation, Bill Witherspoon says his customers simply drove to the U.S., where they can fill up for half his price.
At one time we had 17 people work here, now we have 8. If it weren't for government purchases for government vehicles and some business accounts, we would really be, well, we wouldn't be here.
If the current out-shopping trend continues much longer, Witherspoon says he may not survive. In a similar message, Fort Frances merchants recently published their own mock obituary, hoping it would convince out-shoppers that it is ultimately in their interest to shop at home.
When they save that $15 to $20 on a tank of gas, which what they're saving is the tax, is that the roads are going to suffer. Somebody's got to pay the bill. And if we close or other businesses close, the taxes that would be lost would all revert back to the residential base, and eventually they're going to pay. I mean, there's no free lunch.
Many analysts believe it will take several changes in Canada to restore two-way commerce with the U.S. Among those changes, a devalued Canadian dollar, shifts in the way tax revenues are collected so they can't be evaded, and a more efficient Canadian retail industry. Lunch isn't free anywhere, but for now, it's a good deal cheaper in the United States.
In closing tonight, we welcome a new essayist to the NewsHour. He is Chet Ramo, professor of physics at Stonehill College in Massachusetts and columnist for the Boston Globe. His latest book, The Virgin and the Mousetrap, was recently published. Tonight he talks about why little things mean a lot.
A famous photograph of Albert Einstein shows the great scientist sticking out his tongue. I keep it pinned up over my desk to remind me not to take myself too seriously. And here is a recent etching based on the photograph. What makes the etching special is its size. The portrait is only a few hundred times bigger than an atom. 100 million of these portraits would fit on the head of a pin. The distance from Einstein's nose to the tip of his tongue is measured in billionths of a meter. Billionths of a meter are called nanometers. Welcome to the nanodecade. Nano, as in nanotechnology, nanocomputers, nanorobots. Nano, 1,000 times smaller than micro. In other words, small. Very, very, very small. In my grandmother's house, a huge radio stood on the floor against the living room wall. It was the size of a window. The radio was big because the tubes inside were big, the size of jam jars, and glowing red hot. By the time my parents got their own house, radios set on tables, not on the floor. Tubes had gotten smaller, the size of salt and pepper shakers. On my 14th birthday, in 1950, I was given a radio of my own, about the size of a recipe box. Inside were 6 tubes the size of lipsticks. Electronic tubes were shrinking fast. By the time I went off to college to study electrical engineering, the first computers were appearing in the laboratories, each containing thousands of lipstick-sized tubes in room-filling boxes. The tubes acted like switches, directing electrical signals this way and that. Then, along came the transistor. Transistors did the same thing as tubes, but they were cheaper and more reliable. And they were small, the size of pinheads. Radios shrank to the size of wristwatches. The world of electronics had changed scale from meters to millimeters. The 60s and the 70s were the millidecades. Now things move fast. engineers discovered how to fit a dozen transistors onto a chip of silicon the size of a thumbnail. Then 100, then 1,000, then 100,000. Entire computers were squeezed onto thumbnails of silicon. Put 100,000 electronic switches onto a silicon chip, and each chip will have dimensions of millionths of a meter, called micrometers. Computers that use these chips are called microcomputers. Soon, engineers were building motors and gears on the same scale. Micro machines, microcomputers, microtechnology. The 80s were the micro-decade. Most of us are just getting used to micro, just getting used to automobiles and washing machines that are almost as smart as we are, just getting used to relying all day long on gizmos that are too small to see, just getting used to micro when along comes nano. A Japanese scientist used a device called a scanning tunneling microscope to etch the portrait of Einstein. With a scanning tunneling microscope, engineers can move atoms one at a time, pick them up, put them down, build structures on a scale of billionths of a meter, or nanometers. Last year, IBM scientists used a scanning tunneling microscope to spell out the company logo using 35 xenon atoms lined up on a nickel surface. Now, the same group has announced the creation of an electronic switch that involves the back and forth motion of a single atom. At this scale, the entire contents of the Library of Congress could be stored on a 12-inch disc. The complete works of Mozart, the entire repertoire of classical music, could be stored on a single CD. By the end of the decade, we may have nanocomputers that are 1,000 times smaller and faster than any existing today. I can imagine the time, not so far away, when our automobiles and our washing machines fitted with powerful nanocomputers are smarter than we are. Even now, nano-engineers are planning our ultra-miniaturized future, a future most of us haven't even begun to imagine. Ready or not, here it comes. Welcome to the nano-decade. I'm Chet Ramo.
Again, the main stories of this Thanksgiving Day. President Bush called on congressional Democrats to put aside election year politics to forge a bipartisan plan to help the economy. Muammar Gaddafi refused to turn over 2 Libyan intelligence agents indicted for the bombing of Pan Am 103. The U.S. agreed to pay Iran nearly $300 million for weapons it seized after the 1979 Tehran hostage crisis. Syria accused Israel of trying to derail the Mideast peace talks. Israel has asked the U.S. for a 5-day delay in the next round of negotiations set for next Wednesday in Washington. An Israeli spokesman said he hoped a compromise could be reached. That's our news hour. We'll be back tomorrow night. I'm Robert MacNeil. Good night.
Funding for the News Hour has been provided by PepsiCo. Every day we enjoy people being cold to us, cutting us up, getting fresh with us, tearing into us, and calling us chicken. In fact, the more people do it, the happier we are. PepsiCo. And by AT&T. And by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting. And by the financial support of viewers like you.
Stay tuned to Iowa Public Television for the 1991 All-State Music Festival. 2 hours of festival highlights and music performed by more than 1,000 of Iowa's finest high school musicians.
Video cassettes of the MacNeil-Lehrer News Hour are available from PBS Video. Call 1-800-328-PBS-1. This is PBS.
Acquisition of this program was made possible by Friends of Iowa Public Television. And the Iowa broadcast is made possible by CRST, a family-owned company based in Iowa and a major truck carrier in the United States, which is proud to support the MacNeil Lehrer News Hour.
You're viewing Iowa Public Television. Enjoy more TV worth watching next.
From throughout Iowa, the best high school musicians perform for the 1991 All-State Music Festival. Be sure to watch the 1991 All-State Music Festival tonight at 6:30 here on Iowa Public Television.
4 children enter an enchanted land through a magic wardrobe and find themselves fulfilling an ancient prophecy.
When 2 sons of Adam and 2 daughters of Eve sit in those 4 thrones, then it will be the end, not only of the White Witch's reign, but of her life.
Part 2 of The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe on the next Wonderworks.
Tonight at 8:30, following the All-State Music Festival.
Iowa Public Television. TV worth watching.
TV worth watching. IPTV.
Major funding for the following program is provided by Friends of Iowa Public Television. Good evening and welcome to the 1991 All-State Music Festival. Hello, I'm Pat Bode, your host for Iowa Public Television's traditional holiday broadcast of this showcase of musical talent. For the next 2 hours, you'll see and hear nearly 1,100 students representing 196 high school music programs from all around the state of Iowa. And meet the guest conductors who have helped make this All-State Music Festival one of the finest in the nation. We're in Ames at the Iowa State Center, where for the past 2 days, the All-State Band, Chorus, and Orchestra have been rehearsing the music you'll hear here tonight. These young musicians have worked long and hard for the privilege to come together here in Hilton Coliseum and perform in what, for many, will be the most rewarding event of their musical careers. Let's begin our program with a number that exemplifies this year where pride in our country has hit an all-time high. I can think of no better way to experience this stirring patriotism than to hear the All-State Orchestra and Chorus perform America the Beautiful, conducted by Dr. Eve Ely.